just so
No.
I remember there's a secret Facebook group of UK crime writers. I remember of, and I think they'll enjoy this.
Yeah. Oh no. I wish we could get the cat like balanced on one of the chairs. Just
Oh, I thought he was. Is he up there?
I don't know.
He'll come up. All right. Well, virtual audience, hello. Thank you all so much for joining us. We are welcoming tonight award-winning author Stuart Neville, all the way from Belfast, for his new book, Blood Like Mine. A Goodreads' biggest horror reads of summer and deadly pleasures, most anticipated mysteries and thrillers of 2024. Blood Like Mine is from Hell's 100, a new horror fiction imprint from one of the presses that I love, Soho Press. Ruth Ware says, Blood Like Mine is Stuart Neville at his very, very best. This book grabs your heart and doesn't let go. Tonight, Neville will be in conversation with St. Louis author and horror enthusiast, Kea Wilson. I'll do a little synopsis. Stay on the move, stay out of sight. In LA Times book prize winner Stuart Neville's daring foray into horror fiction, a mother takes desperate measures to protect her daughter in a sinister, blood-chilling highway pursuit across the Southwest. On a snowy December night, single mother Rebecca Carter drives her van into a snowbank to avoid hitting an elk on a desolate mountain highway. She is at the end of her rope. Out of money and food, still, she refuses help from a man in a pickup truck. Rebecca's adolescent daughter, Moonflower, is on the run from a grisly secret, and the last thing they can afford is to be remembered by anyone they meet. Kea Wilson is a novelist, writer, and teaching artist, a graduate of the MFA program at Washington University in St. Louis. Her first novel, We Eat Our Own, was published by Scribner in 2016. She also writes nonfiction reviews and interviews, mostly about urbanism, arts, and culture in the Midwest. She currently serves as a senior editor and advocacy journalist for Streets Blog, and she lives here in St. Louis, Missouri. Stuart Neville, the king of Belfast noir, is the author of 9 novels, including The Ghosts of Belfast, The House of Ashes, and Ratlines, as well as numerous short stories. He has won the Los Angeles Times Book Prize and been shortlisted for the Edgar, Macavity, Dilys, the Barry and Anthony Awards, and the CWA Steel Dagger. He lives near Belfast. Without further ado, we would like to welcome our fantastic guests for the evening.
Thank you so much, Shane, and thank you so much, Stuart, for coming all the way from Ireland to the hottest city on the planet Earth, St. Louis, Missouri. How are you doing today? How are you enjoying St. Louis so far?
It's a bit hot and sweaty. To be honest, I just not long ago come from Phoenix, Scottsdale, which was by the thermometer slightly hotter than here, but the humidity I think has added that extra little bit of grease to everything.
Spoken like a true Midwesterner. It's not the heat, it's the humidity. Well, I'm really excited to talk to you about this book, which I loved reading. I, no pun intended, devoured. I would love to just kind of start with kind of the genesis of it all. Like, how did you come to write this book? What was the seed of the idea? And what was, if there was an inspiration or a moment that led to it, what was that moment?
It was a slightly strange one in that it was one of those rare occasions where the book, the characters, plot, everything just arrived in one big blob in my head in one go. And things that I'd been writing an entirely different book at the time. I was 40,000 words into what I thought was a thriller set in rural Northern Ireland at the end of the Second World War. The premise of that book was a soldier who's come back from the front, who's been badly injured, lost an eye, and he returns to his home village, which is like a village built around the linen mill that's a Brethren village, a bit like Quaker kind of thing. And a new preacher has come to the village and is running it with an iron fist. And the soldier coming back from the front disrupts everything and to end up in a collision course. And it's 40,000 words into that, and nobody was dead yet. And I remember thinking, oh no, am I writing a literary novel? And but I got a bit sort of stuck in the mud with that one. I'd hit that kind of midpoint sort of swamp that you do when you're writing a book.
Sure.
And just out of the blue, this other idea appeared. And as I said, it was so fully formed. I think from the initial spark to having everything mapped out in my head was like a matter of hours. And I was a bit worried, as a writer, you know as well, the danger of the shiny new idea. Because the thing, I don't know, the thing I'm writing at the minute, I always hate with a fiery passion.
Yeah.
And I was like, the next thing I'm going to write, that's going to be brilliant. That's going to win the Booker, if I'm eligible, the Pulitzer. I'm going to get the NWA, the Dagger, I'm going to get the Edgar, I'm going to get every award going. Martin Scorsese is going to adapt it to the screen. It's going to be a massive hit. The next book, it's brilliant. What I'm writing now is awful. And it's just because the shiny new idea is always better because you haven't ruined it yet by actually trying to write it. There's a Doris Lessing said every novel is a ruin of a good idea. And so I was very aware of it, so I didn't want to drop what I was doing and write this other thing, even as strong as the idea seemed. But it kept kind of nagging at me. And so I thought, well, I'll write a detailed synopsis. And that'll scratch the itch, and then I can set aside and get back to what I'm supposed to be doing. So I did that with like a 4 or 5 page synopsis, and that just kind of made it worse. And I realized, no, I'm actually going to have to write this. So I got in touch with my agents and the editors and said, here, this book I'm supposed to be writing, it's not, can do this instead. But thankfully everybody was very accommodating, and they all liked the synopsis, so that's how the book came to be.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I'm not surprised to hear that there was a bit of a swerve that led to this project, because it feels like the whole project is sort of a swerve from your larger body of work. I mean, at least what I know about it, it seems like you are very deep into always horror-inflected crime fiction, and this is, I would say, more crime-inflected horror fiction, more supernatural, in a very, very different setting. You know, you're known as the king of Belfast noir, as we just heard. And we're in the American West here. We are out in the desert, and we are on the highway. Could you talk to me a little bit about making those two big leaps between genres and also between landscapes? Because, again, you appear to be quite Irish, and this book is not Irish.
It didn't feel like that big of a leap for me, to be honest. My first book, The Ghosts of Belfast, the clue was in the title there. Really, when I wrote that book, I thought of it more as a horror novel at the time, and I was working on it with my agents, who got me to look at it as a thriller. And it works as that. And so, I mean, I'm an 80s kid. The first book I read, grown-up book I read, was The Shining at the age of 12. And I learned at the age of 12 seems to be the perfect time to start reading Stephen King. So I read horror all through my teens, and I didn't come to crime fiction until I was in my 20s. And then it was the kind of American neo-noir school of James Ellroy and Dennis Lehane and Macavity later on. And so when I started to write, I mean, I've been writing all night, but when I sat down to start writing seriously in my mid-30s, it naturally came out as a kind of a hybrid of the two. And I wrote 2 novels very quickly that will never see the light of day, both very bad. The Ghosts of Belfast was one that seemed to strike the right balance. And but it was sold and marketed as a crime novel, which it absolutely works. As a crime novel, as a thriller, and it deals with organized crime and political crime and so on, political violence and whatever. But it has this supernatural element, but it is quite ambiguous with it. It does. The premise of that book is a man who was released early from prison as part of the peace agreement in Northern Ireland. Is haunted by the 12 people he killed.
Literally.
Yeah.
I'm halfway through, so, but you should tell them.
But the thing with that book is it's right up until the last moment, it's ambiguous as to what those things are that haunt him, whether they are actual supernatural beings or whether they are just manifestations of his guilt. So it did kind of tread a line between the two more. And I think the difference with Blood Like Mine is it steps over that line and goes full on supernatural.
I mean, it steps over the line, and also I think the other big difference between the 2 books you're talking about right now is felt like mine feels so personal and so deeply deep. I mean, they both feel personal, but that Ghosts of Belfast is so embedded in the history of Ireland and the political moment of like that transition of power. And I want to talk about the characters in this book, and we talked a little bit before the show about how tricky this conversation is going to be, because there is a twist in the middle of this book, and it's a doozy, and I don't want to ruin it for anyone, because I got a lot of pleasure from seeing how you unraveled that. But you got three main characters. I kind of want to talk about each of them. The first one, of course, is Agent Donner, our intrepid FBI detective. And Donner is on the tail of a vicious serial killer who is draining the blood out of their, who knows, victims, and severing their spines. But the twist that is revealed pretty early on, not the big twist I just alluded to, but in fact a different twist, is that all of the victims are pretty bad guys. They are confirmed, in many cases, convicted pedophiles, rapists, predators. How did you go about creating a character who was a defender of these victims who are so reprehensible? That's a big gamble and a big risk. And what does it say about Donner that that's who he's seeking justice for? Because especially as the book goes on, and I think that question became more and more complicated for me.
It's for Donner, I don't think it's a question of justice. I think it's more a question of pride. His issue here is that somebody else is doing what he can't. He sees it as his job to catch these bad people, and somebody else is out there doing it in a much more efficient and ruthless way than he possibly can as part of his job, and that drives him crazy. That and it is purely pride. It's not a moral issue. It's like a male pride thing, basically. And it's that, and it's also the fact that he's lost his family at this stage. He's estranged from his wife and his children, and this investigation has basically filled that gap in his life. It's kind of given him something to work for. Otherwise, he'd go off the rails. And yes, that's really what drives him through, that and his pride. And it's not for him a question of justice or protecting people. It's a matter of he's so annoyed that somebody's doing his job better than he can.
Yeah, I think that's well said. And I mean, there's also the element of addiction. It's revealed pretty early that Donner is an alcoholic. I won't say too much how that is going to play out later in the book, but it draws a line to Rebecca, one of our other main characters. So Rebecca is a mother. She's, as our amazing introduction informed us, on the run from something. We don't know quite what it is for a good while into the book. And she's traveling with her adolescent daughter, Moonflower, with whom she has a really deeply loving relationship that has, I thought, as a former adolescent daughter, some elements that troubled me a little bit. She'll go to extreme lengths to protect this kid. And also her relationship with her kid feels a little obsessive. She talks about mourning the different versions of her daughter when she was young, which I think, I'm not a parent, but I've certainly heard parents say a version of that. It feels like she takes it to a bit of an extreme in this book. Why don't you talk me through a little bit, like how you came up with Rebecca and how you crafted her particular blend of parental devotion and also, without spoiling too much, ruthlessness.
When we meet Rebecca in the opening chapters of the book, she's quite hard. She's been on her own for a while. She's done some terrible things. So there's like a flintiness to her.
Yeah.
And even her relationship with Moonflower veers from being nurturing to being quite harsh as well. But that stems from something that's revealed in a series of letters that are through the book. I discovered in the editing process that they're called epistolary passages. I didn't know that until the editor told me that. They were actually my wife's idea. I was telling her about the book when I was writing, and I was struggling with this idea of how to get across who Rebecca used to be, because she wasn't always this hardened kind of bear trap of a woman, you know.
Yeah.
And I wanted some way to try and show who she used to be. And as my wife suggested, have her write letters to her own daughter. And it's through those letters it's revealed that Rebecca became pregnant at the age of 16, gave birth to Monica, who we know as Moonflower, at the age of 17. And we were shown that Rebecca had plans for her life. She wanted to work in the hospitality industry, she wanted to travel, and she was going to do all this stuff. And, well, first of all, got pregnant. Puts the kibosh on that initially. But she still thinks there's hope that she'll be able to get through that and then still have the life she wanted to have. And then something happens that wipes all that away. So it winds up the only thing she has left is Moonflower, her daughter. And for her, and the reason she's so obsessive in protecting Moonflower is that should anything ever happen to Moonflower, then there was no point to her own existence.
Right.
Because she sacrificed everything for Moonflower. To lose her would be beyond bearing, and that's why she's so fiercely protective to the point of doing the things that she does.
Yeah, I mean, we get all these people therapy for one, for two. But let's talk about Moonflower. She's the other major character in this book that we haven't touched on. And you know, I mentioned that you appear to be quite Irish. You also appear to be a full-grown man. Tell me a little bit about how you approached crafting an adolescent girl in a way that would be compelling and specific, and specifically this adolescent girl. I'm trying so hard to dance around everything that comes here, who's in a really unusual situation and pushed to some really unusual extremes.
It's not a coincidence that at the time I was writing the book, I had an 11-year-old daughter about to turn 12, and everything that goes along with that, which is a lot. And there are certain, I mean, there are even certain texts that Moonflower has in the first chapter. Describes this gesture she has, which is tired of rubbing her nose like this, which my daughter has done all her life. When she was a baby, when she was tired and she needed to sleep, she would start doing this, and she still does it to this day. So Moonflower has that particular tick, and it's a lot of it was just down to having a daughter at that age, and I don't want to call my daughter a monster, but
you can. Speaking as a former 11 and 12-year-old girl, go for it.
But I think a lot of parents would recognize that I don't want to be gender specific here, but a child in flux at the time, a child is going through those massive changes, and has been for a long time. So Moonflower is in herself kind of a tinderbox. You know, she's has that explosiveness that a child of that age will often have, but also that vulnerability and also just still being a child.
Yeah.
It's kind of strange age because my daughter, she'll never see this. She's now 13, and she's kind of gone over that threshold of just being a teenager now. But there was that time where she was that blend of being a teenager in some ways and still being a little girl who loves teddy bears and stuff in other ways, and that's where Moonflower is at that kind of cusp. It's a very, very particular developmental stage for any kid. And my little boy is there now as well, so so seeing it from a boy's point of view as well now.
Yeah. I mean, I'm interested how much you're talking about gender, because I thought about gender a lot when I was reading this book, and the way that you approached, like you mentioned, like Donner's masculinity is a very specific kind of like, I do it masculinity, which I'm like, and Rebecca's approach to motherhood is obsessive, it's devotional, it's not having a lot of independent identity outside of your child. Could you talk about, like, did you ever at any point in this project think about flipping their genders, or think about approaching this in a different way, or making Moonflower a boy? Like, how did you arrive at this specific, like, cast of characters as they manifest through that side of themselves? I guess it's a muddy question, but curious what you have to think.
When the initial idea came along, I did, over the first few hours of figuring out what it was, I did go through different combinations. Well, it'd be a father and son, a mother and son, a father and daughter, And I don't think that's their specific conscious choice to make it a mother and daughter, but that's where we wind up. But also, for some reason, I don't really know why, apart from that book that I've set aside. Ever since I think my fourth or fifth novel, my protagonists have all been female. They've all been women. And it's not a conscious choice, just for some reason, that's where I wind up.
Yeah.
And I think it's because I find women far more interesting to write. And because I was coming from writing kind of procedural crime fiction, when I did have a male cop character, he was very much that archetypal lone wolf, hard drinking, rough-housing kind of cop character. I find if I'm writing male characters, it's much more reliable to fall into cliches. Whereas I find if I'm writing a female protagonist, by necessity, I have to think through more. And I'll talk to my wife a lot about it and get her insights into things. And just for some reason, I prefer that point of view, or that voice when I'm writing. Just because I'm less likely to go with the obvious choice, I think, sometimes.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
It does. It's really interesting. I have to think about that. Is your wife also a writer? Is she one of your big collaborators? It seems like.
She's a librarian.
Oh, cool. Even better.
She studied English at Trinity College in Dublin. And she's far better versed than I am in literature, I would say. And we just every now and again I'll run something by her and say, like, is this how this would feel? Like in the letters, sometimes it's very specific things, like in the letters that Rebecca writes in the first chapter, she describes feeling move inside her, and so it doesn't like, what does that feel like?
Yeah.
And just bubbles popping in your stomach.
Mm.
And that's the description that's used. So it's little things like that I'll go for, but also broader things. Would you think this way? Would you approach it this way? So we learned a lot from her, and great.
Yeah. Well, big ups. What's your wife's name? So we reach out. Jill.
Joe.
Joe. Big ups to Joe. And another choice that I thought was really interesting in this book, and we chatted about this a little bit before, was the choice to set this in the US, which it sounds like you spent time on book tours, you've taken the road trip. How did you, but I will say, as someone who's like a veteran of the American West in particular, the way you describe that landscape is really cinematic, it's really rich. It's as rich as your descriptions of Northern Ireland and your other books that I've read at least. How did you go about researching that and making it feel so embodied? And why was it important that this be an American book instead of the same story transposed in another country?
Because it needed the idea of wilderness, a big sky. And I wrote a book a few years back called Here and Gone, Penny and Pain Back, which is about two children disappearing in that same region of Arizona. And it was the same thing with that book. The story demanded that setting, and it simply wouldn't work. It was set in Ireland, Northern Ireland, because I can drive from one side of Northern Ireland to the other in 2 hours, even the entire country. And so the idea of somebody being able to lose themselves is too hard, just too much of a stretch. And because I'd spent time, for whatever reason, I've done a bunch of book tours, but for some reason I was wound up spending more time in Arizona than anywhere else. And I find that the landscape there fascinating, because coming from Ireland, where it's green and damp and grey and windy, all of a sudden cactus, cacti and this red earth and the deserts, and it's like being on Mars. For me, it just felt so alien. So I always just find the landscape fascinating. So when I was going to set a story there, that seemed a logical place, just because it was such a different place. And I'd been there, and it was around 2015. I did a road trip with a lecturer at Northern Ireland University from Phoenix up to Flagstaff, and seeing the contrast in the landscape from the desert, then climbing up into the Colorado Plateau and the pine forests, the altitude, and just such a radical change in the geography. that I find fascinating as well, and that's a great thing to play with as a writer as well. In fact, you can go from desert to snow in a matter of hours. It's a really, really cool thing to use as a setting.
Definitely. I lived in New Mexico for years, and I always say, like, you can get to every climate on Earth within like a 4-hour drive of Santa Fe. It's wild. Like, you can get to a rainforest if you really want to. So when I talk about visceral, I felt this book was, I have to ask the annoying question that sometimes I get annoyed when people ask me, but film adaptation, has there been any interest in that? Do you have a dream director? You mentioned Scorsese. Do you see this as a book that could translate to film, or you want to translate to film? I felt it was, but I'm curious how you think about eventual adaptation, or if you think about it as you're writing a book like this.
Unfortunately, I'm going to say I can't talk about
Oh,
that.
I love that answer. That's a yes. Great.
Nothing saying yet, but there's stuff happening.
Okay. But I guess I want to ask the more general craft question of, like, horror writing. We're always thinking about horror film. That's like a lot of where we get our vocabulary as horror writers, honestly. And I say this is someone who wrote a book about the making of a horror film, so maybe I'm a little biased, but like, how do you think about filmability as you are writing? Is that something that even like goes into your mind, or do you want to all stand on the page and who cares if it ever gets translated into another medium? How does like the eventual film version of a book live in your mind, if it does?
I try not to think about that at all, because it's. I think if I was thinking about what kind of movie this would make, it would destroy the book. And I do some screenwriting as well, so I can kind of move between the forms. But I do think that people said this about my books before, that there's a cinematic feel, but I actually think there's a bit of sleight of hand going on there, because I leave a lot of space for the reader to use their own imagination. I'm not. I don't. Like you're talking about describing the landscape and so on, I'll tend to use fairly broad strokes. I'll not use an awful lot of detail. I'll not dwell an awful lot on descriptions, whether it's characters or landscape or places. Because they're good for me as a reader. That's what I enjoy to read. I like to read. I like to use my own imagination and fill in the blanks myself. And I think that's what sets a novel aside from any other kind of form of storytelling, is how much it engages the reader's own imagination. That's why you read a book rather than watching a movie. You want to exercise that part of your brain. And I do think if an author imposes too much on what the reader's saying, it kind of takes them out of the story. And I think that's why people feel the books are cinematic. It's actually that they're getting through a lot of the visualization themselves rather than needing it for them.
That's what I was hoping you would say. Yeah. Well, and they're just so kinetic too. I mean, like, a lot of the descriptions are not like hyper visual. They're, a car veering off into a skid, and you feel it in your bones in a way that is really evocative and really cool. Okay, we got a few more minutes before we're gonna wind down here, so I gotta ask, what's next? What are you writing next? What's on the back burner right now?
It is the sequel to Public Minds, we call Public Hours.
Okay.
And is that close
Really?
being finished. Unfortunately, I've been that close to being finished for quite a while now, which has been annoying my editors. But yeah, and then there'll be a third book, and then that'll be this trilogy. Okay,
any previews or hints you can give us into the arc you've seen? I'm curious.
It's hard to do with spoilers, but it does. There's some conversations. There's a character called the nurse in Public Mind who hints at a wider world that Rebecca and Moonflower exist in, and we get to see a bit more of that world. And we also get to see that a lot of the people, or some of the people who are like Moonflower, might not be as innocent as she is.
Okay.
And she might fall in the bad crowd.
Okay, I can't wait. I'm excited. Sorry if that ruins anything for anyone, but I don't think it did, honestly. I think you did a very good job of dancing around that loaded question of mine. And I want to ask, the fun questions are just, what are you reading? Both in terms of what influenced this book and is influencing your upcoming book, and also just what you're enjoying, because we're in a cool bookstore and people can go shopping afterwards.
You Gavino Iglesias' book, as mentioned earlier, I just started, and I hope I get the words the right way around the title, because I don't want to tell Gavino The House of Bone and Rain.
Okay.
Or maybe The House of Rain and Bone, not actually going to the cover.
Bone and rain, rain and bone,
Yeah.
you know.
But he's
Let's call the whole thing off.
he's a terrific writer. He melds really, really dark noir with horror in a really skillful way, in a really organic way. And a lot was based from, on his background as a Latino man. That is his the culture he grew up with, and the previous book, the Delegation Home, there's a lot of I'm trying to phrase this properly, invoking of saints and that kind of, the kind of religious, the how deeply involved religion is into his culture and so on, and the idea of criminals using religion as a way of protection from outside forces where they're doing horrendous things themselves. That's which is just really I find really interesting. And his new book, I've only just started, but it's very, very good as well.
Amazing. Okay, I think we have time for maybe Shane has a question. Hit me, Shane, go ahead.
So this is very much the second event in a row, last night and tonight, that have dealt with serial killers, which is a whole subgenre of fascination. I'm wondering if what your research, because this is not the first time that I've heard of a fictional kind of serial killer renegade trying to get vengeance upon people who have done, I'm thinking of Dexter. Does that type of serial killer exist in the world, or is this what led you to that specific part of the story?
The serial killer like Rebecca, it doesn't exist in the world mostly.
I have one. Go ahead.
Go on.
In Brazil, there was Dexter was inspired by a real serial killer who was a vigilante. So just saying, I don't know. That's my fun bookseller fact. Continue.
There's a line in this book where Mark Donner goes to his boss and says he wants to investigate these serial killings, and he knows the perpetrator is a woman, and the boss dismisses him because, as the boss describes it, you count the number of female serial killers in one hand, but you won't get past your thumb. And there are plenty of cases of women killing people that are in their care. There was a horrendous case in the last few years in England of a nurse killing babies in the maternity ward. That kind of thing happens. Spree killings happen, so on, but the idea of the predatory serial killer is very much a male thing, with the exception of Eileen Gornos. But her circumstances were very, very specific to her. So kind of know this. Something like Rebecca doesn't really exist in the real world. But as a writer, you kind of, that real world only works up to a point. You have to step beyond it now and again.
Do you have any online questions you wanted to take a peek at, or any other last final thoughts?
Yeah.
Okay. Well, unless anyone online wants to be brave, what haven't I asked you tonight, Stuart, that you want to be sure that anyone who views a recording of this in posterity will know?
I'm drawing a blank. I think you've done such a thorough job.
Well, I want to say how much I enjoyed this book. There's a whole other half of the book I would love to dig into with you. We'll have to get your email or something to correspond. But it was it's a book that I think both hit all of my horror hardcore fan needs, that I have to have this amount of blood, I have to have these kinds of scenes. But also it is just such a fascinating moral book in terms of the grayness that you weigh into with all of the characters, the way that you make us keep reading, even though there isn't really there are moments when I rooted for all of these characters and I rooted against all of these characters. And the way he sustained momentum despite casting off typical heroes and villains is really, really cool and really impressive. So thank you for coming all the way to Missouri to talk about it. This is a real treat for me.
Thank you.